gonna introduce Ellen Wohl. Thank you so much for coming today. We're all very excited. So Ellen is a professor at CSU, and she's been in Fort Collins for over 20 years. She got her BS at Arizona State. I don't have to read the years if you don't want. And then I got a PhD at the University of Arizona. So she began her work, and I saw her work first as she's a fluvial geomorphologist, started working on bedrock rivers, and then slowly kind of shifted towards more mountain streams and headwater streams. And being in Colorado, there's a lot of that right there in our backyard. So then she kind of focused on kind of large wood dynamics and the kind of physical ecological interactions with these river ecosystems, and specifically how those large wood dynamics kind of either are connected to or impact the carbon cycling, stream metabolism, kind of heterogeneity of across riverscapes, and just the ecosystem productivity. And then I think the next logical jump is, oh, there's all this large wood, and the beavers are piling up in certain places. That's got to have an impact. And so there's been a lot of new work coming out about the role of beavers and beavers dams and carbon cycling, as well as just kind of biogeochemistry, as well as what would you say, biodiversity and ecosystem productivity. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming out. I think you've authored or edited 20 plus books and countless research articles. So there's a lot to look into. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ellen. And then we'll pick back up with some questions.
That's good. Thank you, Brian. Okay, let me just get into presenter mode here. There we go. Yes, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. Brian specifically asked me when he invited me to do this to talk about three things. So, everybody knows there's so many things you could talk about in relation to beaver and how they affect the environment, particularly in river networks. But I'm just going to briefly touch on these three. So carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and resilience. And I'm emphasizing that because I am a geomorphologist. I'm not an ecologist. So what I'm going to say about biodiversity and habitat is based on a little bit of my own observations, but mainly what I've read of what ecologists and uh, beaver biologists have done. So we'll start with, let me just double check. You're not seeing the control screen, are you? I'm seeing it, but okay, it's obscuring part. Okay, good. I can never tell exactly what presenters versus participants are seeing. So again, a little bit of background, and then I'll talk about each of these three main topics in this order: biomass, biodiversity, carbon, and then resilience to a variety of disturbances. So the brief background is I wanted to explain how I think of river networks, partly in high relief environments like mountain streams, but the concept applies to lower relief environments, less confined areas like alluvial basins or the Great Plains as well. And this is, I've had people ask me now, did you come up with this idea of beads and strings? I did not. It was first proposed by a pair of aquatic ecologists or stream ecologists, Jack Stanford and James Ward, in a paper in the early 90s. But they were looking at gravel bed rivers in the Northern Rockies, and they said, if you follow these rivers downstream, there are these very laterally confined canyon reaches, and then they alternate with these big floodplain reaches. And the floodplain reaches look like beads on a string when you look at them in remote imagery or maps. And I've picked up the terminology because it's very intuitive for a lot of people. If you explain what you mean by beads and strings, they understand it right away. So as an example, this is a Google Earth image of North St. Vrain Creek in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. The big white arrow is the flow direction, and there's a string and a bead. So the upper part has minimal floodplain. It's confined by fairly steep valley walls. It's a single channel. It goes down into a very wide and lower gradient section of the valley that really initiated because it's just upstream of the glacial terminal moraine from the Pleistocene epoch. But that bead, that wide low gradient area, has been heavily modified by beavers. There's multiple active colonies in there. You can see even at this fairly small scale in this image, there's more than one channel. They branch and rejoin. There's a lot of ponded water. Those are beaver dams and ponds of differing ages. Many of them no longer have surface hydrologic connectivity to the main channel, but it's this very rich mosaic. And the beads in general, whether there's beaver present or not, are more retentive of materials moving downstream. if you think about some basic fluvial geomorphology, if you have a wider cross section, anything moving downstream, water, dissolved material, sediment, spreads out and the velocity decreases. So some of that material is going to be stored. If it's sediment, it could be stored for long periods of time. If it's water, it could be stored in the subsurface for weeks to months to many years, or it could be stored in ponded areas like the beaver ponds that you see in this photo for at least a period of months and sometimes years. So when I say that beads are more retentive, I mean they store things that are moving downstream, water, sediment, dissolved material, or solutes. They're also biologically more productive. There's a couple reasons for that. If you are looking at aquatic ecology, so the productivity in the active channel, there's a greater length of active channel per unit length of valley if you've got multiple channels that are branching and rejoining. And you've also got more diverse habitats. So there's flowing water in the channels, there's standing water in the ponds. There's a fairly high water table or water level across the floodplain. So that creates very high primary productivity for riparian or floodplain plants. So there's a lot going on in these beads, and they tend to be more biologically productive. So the retention of materials moving downstream reflects a couple of things. Spatial heterogeneity you could think of as patchiness. And the simplest river corridor possible would be something like an irrigation canal. It's homogeneous, it's uniform, and it would, I've heard this described as the bathtub model for a floodplain. It would just have a flat, uniform surface on either side. That's the floodplain. That is very low spatial heterogeneity. There's really no distinct patches. And I borrowed the term patches from landscape ecology. So landscape ecologists talk about patches. They're areas that are internally consistent, but they're different from adjacent areas. And that's a vague definition because the size is quite variable depending on why you're defining patches, and the criteria you use to distinguish patches also varies depending on what you're interested in. So if I was looking at a floodplain, I could distinguish patches based on riparian vegetation, water level, the grain size distribution of material underneath. There's lots of criteria I could use. But the idea is that if you have a lot of patches in something like a bead, some of those are not going to be very efficient at transmitting material downstream. They're going to store it. Lateral and vertical connectivity. Lateral connectivity refers to the ease of movement of materials between the active channel and the floodplain. If you have a high lateral connectivity, if you've got something like a flood, for example, a lot of that water is going to move quickly onto the floodplain and then move downstream more slowly. Vertical connectivity refers to between the surface and the subsurface. If you have high vertical connectivity, you can have water that's recharging the groundwater, or you can have shallower exchanges called hypereic exchange flows. Hypereic water refers to water that starts in the channel, goes into the subsurface, and then returns to the channel. So the point is, if you've got a spatially heterogeneous or patchy bead, you're spreading materials across it. Some of them are going into the subsurface, some of them are getting hung up in slow places in the floodplain. Everything just moves downstream more slowly and creates this retention. Beads are also more resilient to natural disturbances like flood, debris flow, wildfire, drought, and I'm going to come back to this point and explain it more at the end, and human disturbances, whatever you might want to consider, chemical spills, water diversion. There are lots of different things we do that are ecological disturbances or changes in resource availability for organisms. So the point I want to emphasize in the context of this talk is beavers don't create beads. The bead geometry is set up by topography and really by the underlying structure of the rocks, the characteristics of the geology, and things like the glacial history. But beavers definitely change the functionality of beads. They change that patchiness and how well material moves downstream or is stored within beads. So this bead that you're looking at here, again, it's upstream of a glacial terminal moraine, but the beavers have modified that bead pretty extensively with their dams and ponds and canals. And just to make this a little more obvious, this is an example of a string. This is a different channel than we were just looking at. It's on the western side of Rocky Mountain National Park, but steep, narrow, there's not much floodplain. There's not really any floodplain there. This is the same channel on the west side of the park in a bead section that was modified by beaver in the past. There's no beaver there now, but you can see a very strong contrast, and you can see hopefully how material would move downstream much more slowly in an environment like this than rather than the string that I just showed you. Okay, so the three basic functions: biodiversity, carbon, and resilience. Again, this is coming mostly from work by ecologists, but the range of papers that I've read, as far as I can tell, every single thing that they've looked at, from literally bacteria and microbes through macroinvertebrates, plants, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, excuse me, all tend to be more diverse in beaver meadows, sorry, or beaver modified beads because there's more habitat diversity. So, if you think back to those photos I was just showing you, there's ponded water, there's flowing water, there's ponds that are infilling with sediment, there's wet meadows, there's conifer forests, there's deciduous forests in these beaver modified beads. There's quite a bit of habitat diversity. And for aquatic organisms, there's a greater abundance of habitat because instead of having just one active channel flowing down a length of valley, if you've got secondary channels that branch and rejoin, they've got differences in water chemistry, water temperature, the speed of the flow, the substrate on the bed, the degree of shading. So there's more aquatic habitat and there's more diversity of it. And also for the riparian habitat, again, if you have a patchy environment where there's different ages of riparian or floodplain vegetation that's growing back, there's some areas of ponded water, but differing degrees of infilling, you're just going to have a lot more diverse habitat. So these are just a few examples. The upper one here, that's a very photogenic moose calf and cow. They're kind of the enemy for the beaver in Rocky Mountain National Park. They're big competitors for food, but they do thrive in beaver meadows. The one at the top is a tiny little macroinvertebrate casing sitting on the palm of my hand. They had chewed off cattail type plants to create this casing. I think this is a specific type of water sedge. I saw Sarah Marshall's on the call. Sorry, Sarah. I think it's Carex aquatilis, something like that. Frogs, waterfowl, and at the center of it all, of course, the beaver. And just to emphasize the diversity of the habitat, this is that same site in Rocky Mountain National Park where I first illustrated beads and strings. So this is on North St. Vrain Creek. This is looking down at that beaver meadow. You can see a lot of ponded water. This is some details within the beaver meadow. So there are very small secondary channels. This is a beaver trail that is concentrating runoff and will probably become a very small secondary channel. This is an off-channel pond that no longer has surface connectivity, but it is connected in the subsurface. So there's about a week, a 7-day lag between when flow goes up or down in the main channel and when flow goes up or down in the pond. And these are different types of secondary channels that are present in the same beaver meadow at different times of year. So again, a wide array of habitat for aquatic and riparian organisms to choose from, and also the terrestrial animals that come into the beaver meadow for at least part of their time. And another example, this is the Duke River in the Yukon Territory in Canada. This was the main channel. It's a braided river gravel bed, and beavers had built this really nice dam and pond that's well above the main channel. So the main channel is at the back, if you can see my cursor. There's secondary channels in the foreground, but they dammed up a spring that was coming out at the base of the hillside. So really enhanced the diversity here. These are different views of that pond, and these are smaller secondary channels that they also had dams on. And one last example, this is the Chena River north of Fairbanks in Alaska. I included this picture because I've read papers by biologists that have looked at invertebrate diversity, and they found that there's a distinctive suite of invertebrates that live even on a beaver lodge. So there's differences in the water habitats, the flowing and standing water in a beaver meadow, but there's also distinctive communities of invertebrates that live on the lodges and dams versus some of the other environments. Okay, so the second topic that Brian had asked about, sediment and organic matter storage. Beaver dams, of course, are obstructions to flow. So they create ponded areas of backwater with lower velocity where sediment settles out. And that may or may not be long-term storage. If the dam fails, you can have a sediment pulse that goes downstream with an outburst flood. But one of the things that I've seen in these beads where you've got space, or the beavers have space to build multiple dams and to move around through time, is even if a particular dam and pond fill in with sediment, they can move somewhere else and build another dam and create ponded water. So the upper photo, actually both of these photos are from a place called Little Beaver Creek in Colorado. This was after the 2020 wildfire in Colorado, in this part of Colorado, and in the summer of 2022, there was a major flood here. The ground vegetation on the hill slopes had not grown back very much, so there was a very intense rainfall that triggered a debris flow in a tributary and that caused really severe flooding in the main stem. But the lower photo, that's an old beaver dam. It had been abandoned long before the fire, storing a lot of sediment. And this is a close-up, but there are 4 dams like this in a row on this part of the valley. You can't see the channel. It's where my cursor is. It's in the background. This is an off-channel pond. The photo on top is one of the dams and ponded areas on the channel that breached in that flood. And what you're looking at here is really organic rich sediment. So it's sediment that has a lot of um, dead plant parts, from logs like you see here to small uh, bits of plants, leaves, twigs, etc. Any plant is on average 50% carbon. So if you're storing organic matter in the sediment of beaver ponds, you're also storing carbon. And any place in a river corridor can store organic matter and carbon, but if it's an area where there's freely available oxygen, what's known as an oxidizing environment, there are a lot of microbial communities that basically eat that plant material and they release some of the carbon to the atmosphere. If you have saturated soils where you have what's known as reducing conditions, then there are microbes that live in there too, but there's not as many and they're not as efficient. So you build up this accumulation of organic matter and carbon through time. If you've spent any time walking around in beaver ponds or any kind of wetland, you may be familiar with that very unpleasant smell, sort of smells like rotten eggs, and the very black, wet soils that you get. Those are carbon sinks. So I'm sort of conflating 2 things here. The first one is sediment storage, which can be very important in a variety of settings, especially after wildfire. When you have a very intense wildfire that burns off the ground vegetation, any sediment on the hill slopes is more susceptible to erosion, usually for the first 2 to 3 years during rainstorms. So you can get huge amounts of sediment coming into river corridors, moving through the river network into lakes or into drinking water reservoirs. In my part of Colorado, I'm not sure how much it applies to other parts of the world. The loss of life associated with wildfires is there's more people who die after the fire in floods and debris flows rather than actually during the fire itself. So these post-fire hazards are very severe. And if we can store the sediment in places like old beaver dams that are spread throughout river networks, that reduces downstream hazards. The other thing that I was conflating with sediment storage was this organic matter storage, which gets into carbon sequestration. But I wanted to highlight a couple of recent papers that came out in the last calendar year. Sarah Dunn is now with the U.S. Geological Survey up in Tacoma, Washington, but she looked at the sediment that accumulated in a series of beaver ponds after that 2020 wildfire and compared that to analogous beaver ponds where the catchment was not burned, and found that, as you might expect, beaver dams are very effective sediment traps. So they can really attenuate those downstream fluxes of post-fire sediment. And then his name is James, but he goes by Huck. Huck Reese, this was his master's work. He's now a PhD student. I think it's San Diego. It's one of the University of California campuses. He looked at sedimentation rates and organic carbon storage in beaver ponds. And again, both of these studies showed that beaver ponds are very effective sediment traps, and they also trap a lot of organic matter. And sort of transitioning into the carbon part of this, I wanted to go back to some work that one of my PhD students, who's also with the USGS now, did several years ago. We were looking at carbon storage throughout river corridors in the Front Range and looking just at the subalpine part, so the higher elevation forested parts. Nick looked at strings and he found on average, I'm averaging across dozens of samples that he took, but something like 150 megagrams of carbon per hectare of surface area. So this is surface area of the floodplain and channel in the strings. The beads almost double that. So this is an example of a type of bead where unconfined just means it's a bead. There's less lateral confinement from the valley walls. Multi-thread here means there's channels that branch and rejoin. The beaver meadow, this is the one that I started out the talk with, more than double what you see in the strings. So 316 megagrams of carbon. Again, very high primary productivity, so lots of plant litter going into the sediment, and the sediment is very wet, so that material accumulates. The pooled mean radiocarbon age, you could think of that as the average residence time for material in the beads was 1,500 years. YBP means years before present. So something like 1,500 years that this material is being stored on average. And by comparison, the uplands, the carbon stored in soil and downed wood, is more like the confined or the thread reaches. So the bottom line for this is that those beads, especially where they're modified by beaver, are disproportionately important in terms of carbon and sediment storage. If you look at the bead in the foreground here, it's got a greater surface area, but it also has a greater thickness of sediment and a far higher carbon concentration in that sediment. That's why I say they're disproportionately important. On a per unit basis, the sediment and carbon is being stored in these areas, and they typically have a longer residence time for that material than the string sections. And depending on where you are, I know you're not all in the Western US. This should show up in the Eastern US too. It's very common in the West. This is a cut bank that was exposed. We had a large flood in 2013. This is along a place called Fish Creek near Estes Park. The only place I see such organic rich dark horizons that are either dark brown or black in our mountain streams are where there was a beaver meadow. Otherwise, our soils look more like what you see in the bottom here. And I know this applies to the Eastern US because if you've ever read The American Beaver and His Works, which I think is 1898 is the publication, Morgan, I believe, is the author, or Enos Mills, some of the early writings on beaver, those are both books. They talk about beaver meadows and how early indigenous agricultural peoples and then European settlers would target those areas for growing their crops because there was such high soil fertility in these portions of the river network. These floodplains were unusually rich in terms of soil nutrients. And the work on carbon storage in beaver meadows really goes back to Carol Johnston's work. I think she's at South Dakota State University, but from 2014, she demonstrated that there was a higher concentration of carbon in the soils that are formed when beaver ponds fill in and the beavers abandon the site. And then in 2012, we were looking at the distribution of carbon concentrations on carbon stock, so the amount of carbon per unit area in different parts of the mountain streams, and showed that the beaver meadows are disproportionately important. And then Deanna Laurel was one of my former PhD students who looked at how long this lasts. If beaver abandon a site and the soils dry out, you lose some of the carbon, but you still have more carbon per unit area than you do in streams or in areas that were never modified by beavers. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was resilience. And resilience here, what I'm using, I'm sort of folding in resistance and resilience. Resistance means that there is a disturbance, you could think of it as a natural disaster, and the system just isn't very affected. It doesn't change much. Resilience, it's affected, but it recovers quickly. And for river corridors, three of the big natural disturbances are drought, fire, and flood. So as I mentioned, beaver modified sections of river are more resistant and resilient to all three of these. For a drought or fire, you can just look at the amount of standing water in these top two photos. It's a wet environment. So even if things dry out during a prolonged drought, there's still more water stored here in either the surface water or in the sediments and subsurface groundwater than there are in other parts of the river network. And we saw this in 2020 when there's a fire. these areas don't burn. They may scorch a little around the edges, and if the beavers have abandoned them and they're drier, then they do burn, but they're pretty fire resistant. Floods, if you look at the lower photo, this was taken in early June. These are all the same site on North St. Vrain Creek. The willows are just leafing out. Uh, I can tell you from personal experience, it is quite the struggle to walk across this beaver meadow. You can fight your way through those multi-stemmed willows, then you fall into a hidden beaver canal, and then you have to wade through a pond. There's a lot of what geomorphologists or hydrologists would call frictional resistance. So when a flood comes into an environment like this, well, it would be like you trying to push through the willows. There's a lot of resistance. The floodwaters slow down. They move much more slowly through this portion of the river. When we had the flood of record in this system in 2013, I was desperate to get up here and see what was going on because I was working on this beaver meadow at the time. And first, um, all the roads were destroyed between where I live and this area in Rocky Mountain National Park. And then they got the roads, some of the roads at least, repaired remarkably fast. But this is a perfect thing to say on this particular day, given our deadline tomorrow. But our government shut down, so the national park was closed, so I couldn't get in there. But when I did finally get in there, I couldn't even tell there'd been a flood. And other parts of this river network, there was massive erosion and deposition. The floodwaters had been so slowed by all of this frictional resistance that the only way I could tell there was a flood was when I went to the upstream end. And then I started to see sand and gravel deposition and large wood that had been deposited as soon as it sort of hit the wall of willows, which would be up here where I've got the cursor. So these systems are also very resistant to floods. And again, other people have looked at this. So Sherry Westbrook is at Saskatchewan, done a lot of really nice work on beaver effects. She was looking at how a series of dams and areas of ponded water really slow down a flood when you have this concentration of flow coming into the river corridor. And Alan Puttock is in, I don't know him, he's in the UK. I can't remember if it's Scotland or England, but they've been doing a lot of beaver reintroduction in the UK. And there are multiple beaver dams in sequence. So this group has been looking at a lot of the effects associated with those. And they've again found that these slow down the flood peaks because of all those obstructions in the way of the flood. Glynis Hood and Suzanne Bailey are Canadian ecologists who work on beaver, and they've shown that the effects of climate here, they were looking at drought. If you are storing water in the surface and subsurface, the drought affects that portion of the river less severely. And then Emily Fairfax is at University of Minnesota and has done a lot with fire. And this is a great title, Smokey the Beaver. She's found that these wet areas are resistant and resilient to fire. So they either don't burn or they recover more rapidly. And I saw Wally McFarlane is on this call. So this is a photo that his colleague Joe Wheaton gave me of a site in Idaho. And it's a very nice illustration after fire. The adjacent drier uplands are very burned, and this beaver modified portion of the river corridor didn't burn. So it's this oasis of green immediately after the fire. So when I think of how these beads function with the presence of beavers, I go back to an idea from ecology where ecologists talk about alternate states. You can have the same area that can be in one configuration and one set of functions that are stable and persistent. That same area could exist in a very different state. You need something to shift them in between. And the famous example for rivers is beaver meadows versus elk grasslands. So beaver meadows are what I've just been showing you. You have this threshold where there are beaver present. They build a series of dams, they dig canals. Those dams are obstructions, so they increase backwater, they increase overbank flow across the floodplain. That creates floodplain wetlands. It creates a high water table that favors things like willows, river birch, alder, cottonwood, aspen. It also favors the creation of secondary channels that branch and rejoin. All of that is great habitat and food for the beaver. You get more beaver, they build more dams and ponds. You have this self-enhancing feedback. It's spatially extensive. It can go across the entire valley floor. It's persistent. At this site in Rocky Mountain National Park, we are not allowed to use motorized drilling rigs, but we've used hand coring. We can go down about 1.5 meters and we get radiocarbon ages of 5,000 years. So the beaver have been at this site for at least 5,000 years, probably longer. It's very complex or spatially heterogeneous or patchy. And it's very connected in the lateral dimension between the channel and the floodplain and the vertical dimension between the surface and the subsurface. And as long as the beaver are present and they have food, this can persist for a long time. The other side of this threshold, if the beaver disappear for some reason, and the reason the alternative state is called elk grasslands, beaver can leave a site for a lot of reasons, but competition with ungulates like elk and moose is one of the things that can drive beaver out, because if I hold my hand up, this is a multi-stemmed willow, beaver will chew off each stem at the base and the willow resprouts. Elk and moose will eat the top of each stem, so they're eating the growth tips, and if the grazing pressure is heavy enough, the willows become very stunted. They may only be living still in roots. They may disappear completely from the surface. In that case, the beavers don't have winter food. They don't have very good dam building material, so they disappear. The beaver dams aren't maintained, so you lose that backwater effect. You lose the obstructions that create overbank flow. The flow concentrates into a single channel, as you see in the lower right here. There's more flow energy directed at the bed and banks, so the banks often erode. They're also maybe less stabilized by willow roots. There's less roughness or hydraulic resistance associated with that woody vegetation. Channel cuts down. Often the entire floodplain will drain. So you'll have this drier environment. It's still wetter than the adjacent hill slopes, but it's not as wet as when the beaver are present. So that's called an elk grassland. There are fewer patches. You've lost that lateral and vertical connectivity. So that's what I mean by disconnected. You've increased the longitudinal connectivity. Everything goes downstream faster, but you tend to have a drier floodplain in a single channel. And now it's hard for the beaver to come back. Even if they're reintroduced, you probably have to fence out the grazing animals, and you may have to actively replant some of that woody vegetation like willows. So in this upper half, where you have a beaver meadow, it's resilient to disturbances. There are other nutrients that are being taken up. If you've got water spreading into the floodplain and infiltrating into the subsurface, you can take up nitrate. If you're storing sediment, you're storing phosphate. There's carbon storage, there's biodiversity, more abundance of organisms. So there's a lot of positives on the side of the beaver meadow. So I'll end there because I know we wanted to keep this to about 30 minutes with a picture of a beaver and its works. And hopefully we have time for questions. Thank you.
Great.
Brian,
Oh,
would you prefer that I stop sharing or just leave this photo up?
I guess we can leave it up, and
Okay.
if folks have questions about a slide, we can pop back if that's all right with you.
Mhm.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. And I did ask you, I was like, hey, you want to talk? Here's a bunch of things I want to know about. So thank you. Um, yeah, that was great. So I will open it up as people get sick of me talking. Do folks have questions? You can go ahead and raise your hand or just type it into the chat and we will do our best. Adam, if you can help me see folks too, that would be great.
Will do. I will help facilitate. Don't be shy, folks.
Well, while we're waiting, in the interest of transparency, I'll say that the left and the upper right photos are from Colorado, where I have yet to see a beaver, even though they're around. They avoid me. So the lower right is a beaver I finally saw in Alaska.
Oh, all right. We got a question from Tony.
Yeah, Ellen, I just got your book the other day and have it on the bedside reading it at night now. So, but right before BeaverCon, I was in uh, went to Rocky Mountain to do a little vacationing and talk to some of the Park Service people, and they were telling me about the the moose and elk grazing the willows there. And so, what activities do they said something about they're doing some fencing out of areas to get the willows to grow. Do you have an update of what's going on in the Rocky Mountain Park on
Yes,
the western
they
side?
for reasons I think I'm not sure why, but they don't want to do beaver reintroductions, but they have been adding more and more grazing exclosures. I mean, some of those are more than a decade old, and they continue to add more. They have a pretty good handle on the elk population because that's been creating problems for a while. So they have done, they've had various attempts to control the elk population. It's nicely chronicled in a book that was published, I think, back in the 80s called Rocky Times and Rocky Mountain National Parks. The moose are a more recent issue, and they've got a radio color study of the moose. They're trying to figure out exactly the population and how much moving around they're doing. I find it personally hard to believe that moose were never native in Colorado, but they certainly were extirpated and not present at the time the park was designated in 1915, but they were introduced or reintroduced to southern Wyoming in the 1970s, and they've come down to the park now and they're doing extremely well. The wolves, you may know we have, there was a voter initiative that passed wolf reintroduction for Colorado in 2020, but they're not going to be reintroduced here. They're being reintroduced in the southern part of the state where there's larger areas of wildlands. But the wolves have reintroduced themselves from Wyoming. I don't know if any have been seen yet in Rocky Mountain National Park, but there was a pack that had pups in North Park, which is, it borders on Rocky Mountain National Park. So at some point, no matter what the Park Service does, if the wolves get down here, they're going to get fat and lazy. I mean, there's so many ungulates. And I'm hoping it will be analogous to Yellowstone, where it will help at least some of these areas.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah. Well, if no other hands are up, when I said I was staying and on that side, I was in Grand Lake, and one of the slides looked like the meadow. Maybe I hiked up from Grand Lake up the trail to, it looked like the same meadow that I saw up
Was
there
it
where it had been.
North Inlet or East Inlet?
Yeah, one of those
Yeah.
two.
I think those were East Inlet photos that I showed
Yeah.
early
Okay,
on.
cool. I saw the same thing. Thank you.
Yep.
So I guess I have a question. Sorry, I can't see if someone else. In terms of kind of carbon storage, how easy is it to measure from various, like pre or post project, right? And I mean, you're talking about it's stored for 1,500 years. So there's relics there. I'm just curious how easy it is to measure, along, a stream corridor. Yeah.
Not that easy. I have another former PhD student, Sarah Hinshaw, who did exactly this. She looked at carbon storage in stage 0 restoration projects. If you're familiar with that terminology, that's recreating something like a very wet, laterally connected bead. It could be a beaver meadow, or it could be a lot of large wood that's added to the river corridor. She did sites in Colorado, Oregon, and Utah, and it's very hard to detect a signal. It's not something that changes quickly. You also can have relic carbon storage. So Sarah was comparing sites that we called reference. They were in very good condition. They had never been degraded. She was comparing those to degraded sites and to restored sites. And the bottom line statistically was that there was slightly more in the restored sites than in the degraded sites, but there was a lot of scatter because it depends so much on the site-specific details, and the reference sites always had more carbon. But to get back to your original question of how to measure it, you can inventory the amount of large wood and then assume that, so you can calculate a volume of large wood and assume that it's 50% carbon. For the soil carbon, what we do is take soil samples. We use soil auger and we sample it like 15 centimeter increments for however deep the soil is. Most of the carbon is in the upper half meter. And we send those to a commercial soil lab that figures out the bulk density and the percent of carbon, the concentration of carbon. And I showed Nick Sutphin's work earlier. Nick was the one who did dozens and dozens of samples throughout the Colorado Front Range, and he did some Monte Carlo simulations. And for each area of a river corridor, so like this one beaver meadow on North St. Vrain Creek, you need a minimum of 11 samples to accurately characterize the spatial variability within that. And that is a minimum. So, the cost of this analysis, we've always had it done by commercial or university labs. It's about $50 to $60 per sample. But I think the key thing is you will see an immediate difference in the moisture of the soil, and you'll start to see silt and clay accumulate, but it seems to take at least a few years to see a difference in carbon. The sites that Sarah was looking at, the oldest ones had been restored 5 years earlier. So I would say it takes longer than 5 years to really see a difference.
Cool.
And I don't know with this series if you have a repository or you share references, but I'm happy to send any of these references after the fact, like Sarah's papers or Nick's papers or anything else.
Yeah, that'd be great, and I can follow up with you because we are working on that. That's a next step. Yeah, going forward. So I guess just a quick follow up, and then I'll move on. So would you, because beavers are actually creating it's a leaky dam, but all the same, if you had a well connected floodplain, so you have broad multi-thread system where you're inundating the floodplain pretty frequently, so you're wetting that valley bottom. Do you think you would be able to store a similar amount of nutrients and carbons? There's large wood in those systems to an area, or is there actually, would the beaver dams that create a little bit more of an impediment actually provide a significant increase in kind of the nutrient cycling, carbon storing?
No, anything that blocks the flow and keeps the valley bottom wet. The other thing I didn't show in that slide where I was putting all those numbers up from Nick's study, we found a couple of valley segments where there was highly fractured bedrock and a lot of groundwater inflow. There were no beaver present, but the soil was almost like peat. It was 35% organic carbon concentration, which is remarkably high. So anything that promotes primary productivity and wet soils will give you a lot of carbon storage. I mean, there's soil scientists and wetland scientists have known for decades that wetlands, any kind of wetland, mire, bog, fen, swamp, marsh, they're all carbon storage hotspots.
Ellen, there's a question in the chat from Allison Cook asking, and this might be especially relevant to sites outside of the national park, but is anyone looking at toxicology of stored sediments and or remediation of toxins through these sediments?
Not in Colorado. I think the only place that would be a big issue would be around some of our 19th century metal mining sites. And I know some of those were Superfund sites and they created constructed wetlands. I think people have looked at that in other parts of the country. I'm trying to, of course, the vast majority of the literature on beavers comes from North America. There's more coming out of Europe and the UK now as they're doing beaver reintroduction, but I'm trying to remember. I think people have looked at the potential for storing heavy metals in beaver sediments because a lot of the really toxic heavy metals will adsorb or attach to silt and clay size particles. So if you can sequester those in the floodplain, they're still really toxic, but they're not being dispersed throughout the length of the river network.
And I think Adam, Adam threw in a link for people from one of the Beaver Institute's Beavers and webinars about this topic. And so that YouTube link is in the chat.
So this is maybe a little off the wall, but if no one else is raising their hand, I'll ask. So I was just curious if so I'd say, and I guess I was thinking even in the East Coast, but certainly in the West where you do have kind of ranching and ag alongside these stream corridors, if you know of somebody who actually kind of worked out a nice balance where you could get kind of these more resilient systems where you get, kind of nutrient cycling, we'll say, not just carbon across the board, but that biodiversity, and where it has extended out to, I guess I was thinking like where it actually shown to be beneficial towards, ag. There's, lots of kind of flood irrigation going on. But certainly for ag, if you have more nutrient rich carbon, deep soils, that could be a benefit. Of course, if they encroach into where those good soils are, you're losing it.
Well, so there are places where people have cattle grazing, but if you keep them moving, I mean, it's the same with the elk and moose. It's not that they browse the willows that's a problem. It's that they camp out and do nothing but browse the willows. So you can have cattle grazing, but if you manage the cattle intensively and have lighter grazing or rotational grazing that can work. The other issue, of course, is increasing or sustaining base flow downstream of these big water storage areas. And so far, most of what I've seen is anecdotal. There's an interesting book. I don't like the title, but it's a really nice book. It's called Three Against the Wilderness. It's from the 1950s. A family that homesteaded in, I can't remember if it's Alberta or Saskatchewan, north of the border, our 51st state? No, sorry, bad joke. They reintroduced beaver and they saw an increase in sustained base flow during the dry season. The only quantitative study I'm aware of that has demonstrated this is by Karen Gran at the University of Minnesota at Duluth, but she was able to show an increase in base flow downstream from beaver dams. I think there will be more studies to come, but there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence. I can also think of papers that I read that were published in the 80s from Arizona and New Mexico, where they described an ephemeral stream becoming perennial after they reintroduced beaver, but they were focused on the ecology, so they didn't measure stream flow.
So we have another question in the chat, and then we'll go to Tony, who has his hand up. So in the chat from Luan Wan, she's wondering if there are any signals that are helpful in distinguishing active, relic, and abandoned beaver dams or ponds, both on the landscape and through remote sensing.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy on the landscape. You're looking for recent chew. You're looking at beaver trails that have got foot marks in the mud or paw prints. All the evidence that animals living in an area leave. Remote, you could probably look at whether the dam looks like this that I've got showing here, where there's fresh, recently chewed wood versus what I call beaver berms. When the dams are abandoned, they may not completely fall into disrepair, and they're still sort of a vegetated berm, almost like an artificial levee, but they've got vegetation growing on them. Those often show up in remote sensing because of a change in vegetation. And sorry, I can't see the full participant list. If Sarah Marshall is still on the call, she might want to add to this because she's with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program and she has developed a remote sensing approach to identifying beaver ponds. And I don't know if that includes degrees of activity. I guess the short answer, Luann, there's a series of indicators that you can use in the field to tell whether the dam is still active or not. And then there are other things that can often tell you remotely whether there's beaver activity. And it gets a little complicated because sometimes they'll abandon a site and then come back and reactivate it.
Sarah, let us know if you want to add anything to that, but I'm going to go to Tony while he has his hand up.
Okay.
I think Sarah just unmuted.
Okay, Sarah, sorry.
Or I unmuted you, Sarah, sorry.
Yeah, no, this is a pretty extensive topic, but to keep it concise, we look for the shape of beaver ponds, and you can kind of track the extent of surface water in that area over time using things like machine learning and other remote sensing approaches. So we found that to be really helpful. And I know Emily Fairfax's group has done some similar work using the actual form of the beaver dams themselves. So those have been our most useful indicators, and I'm happy to post a link to some of our mapping tools that show beaver ponds found in those ways.
Sorry, before Tony asks this question, I'll steal Emily's line that I've heard and always makes me laugh. With their artificial, I think it's called eAger. She developed it with Google. And she likes to say the program showed an inordinate fondness for cul-de-sacs. So I guess it's looking for circular things as well.
All right, Tony, thank you for being patient.
Oh, that's okay. One thing I've been trying to wrap my head around is how to articulate the flooding discussion. I might not get my point across in the first try at this, but if there's a valley with no beaver dams and let's say you get a big rain, 10-inch rain, that flood will fill up to a certain level. And then now you go to the same valley, put a beaver dam in. The part of the storage of that valley has already been taken up by the beaver dam. And so the only extra flood retention you get is just the whatever is above the original line of the beaver dam. So that in that respect, it seems like it's hard for me to articulate that they are providing more flood storage when the pond is already taking up some of the storage itself. How do we go about it? If I get challenged on that at any talk or anything, how do I articulate that?
I think that the key is you don't think of the water as just standing as though it's in a bathtub. The water in the floodplain and in the channel continue to move downstream during a flood. The issue is that they move downstream more slowly if there's more obstructions and hydraulic resistance. So if they're moving more slowly, that also means the depth is going to increase. So sure, you've got a certain amount of storage that's taken up already by the beaver dam and pond, but you just add more on top of that when you get more rainfall or more water inputs. And it moves downstream more slowly, which means you have a lower magnitude flood peak farther downstream. So, people talk about flashiness. You put the rainfall in, the hydrograph does this. It goes up really fast, and it goes down really fast. And that's when we have all sorts of problems with damage and hazards. If you take that same amount of water and you spread it out through time, so the hydrograph is more like that. It lasts longer, but it's a lower magnitude. That's one of the effects of a beaver meadow, and that is usually regarded as ideal for reducing flood hazard. So yes, any point on the river network, like where I've got the cursor, is going to be flooded longer, but you're not going to have quite as many hazards downstream.
I guess I was thinking if there's no meadow there's only a pond and you're not getting meadow for the roughness. Yeah, I understand the roughness would slow it down.
Then I think it would depend on how much lateral confinement. So if this is the valley walls,
Yeah.
At some point, if the flow gets deep enough, the beaver pond isn't going to be having much effect. You're going to have what hydrologists or hydraulics refers to as skimming flow over the top. But it's very much a function of how much water you have versus the size of the valley.
Just the valley shape above the beaver dam.
Yeah, if you were on a first order tiny little channel that was laterally confined, sure, the whole beaver dam and pond could be submerged. But the bigger the river, the less likely that is to happen. Usually you can have gorges on larger rivers, but usually you've got more gently sloping valley walls and more of a floodplain.
Yeah, well, thank you. I've been struggling to try to figure out how to articulate that.
And I should say that there are multiple grad students. I'm on a committee for one at the University of Georgia and one here at CSU who are doing hydraulic modeling now with different scenarios of beaver dams in terms of the spacing downstream, the porosity or permeability of the dam, the height of the dam, and looking at it in detail at how they affect flood peaks. So these students are going to finish within the next year, but within the next decade, I think we're going to have a lot more information on that question.
The one at the University of Georgia, would you be able to share their name?
Yeah, it's Hattie Greydanis. She's a student of Brian Bledsoe's. I think her last name is Greydanus.
Say that again.
I can't remember if it's an E or an A, but Gray, and then it's all one word, Danus, Danus. I was just on a Zoom call with her yesterday. She's going to be defending sometime this summer.
Hattie.
Yeah.
And the professor was Bledsoe. I think I have met him because I'm asking about that because we're starting the Southeastern Beaver work group here, and I'm just trying to pick up people in the Southeast that are working on beaver.
She is looking at also one-dimensional versus two-dimensional modeling because everybody does one-dimensional, but two-dimensional is more appropriate. It's just more work.
But it's flood modeling. Okay, thank you.
That sounds like someone we should twist their arm and get them to give a talk here. I think a lot of us get it's an interesting question, but a lot of us also get dinged with it in restoration, projects. Well, beaver dam blow out, and here's what's going to happen, and if it's low tech, restoration, you're like, modeling would blow my entire budget.
She
So,
she would be perfect because the two sites she's focusing in on are actually sites that have BDAs and beaver. So one of them is in South Park, Colorado. Mark Beardsley, if you're familiar with him, he's with
yeah.
Ecometrics. Yeah, it's one of his sites on Rough and Tumbling Creek, and the other is one of Sue Nisgota's sites in Washington State. And that's in the middle of ag lands, stream flowing through crop fields.
Cool.
I will add to that comment, Tony, that the urban beaver ponds that we have here in Charlotte, the beaver dams, we have huge beaver wetlands because the valleys are wide enough. And
Mhm.
I agree with Brian. The question I always get is, oh, we don't want to have urban beaver dams because they're going to blow out and all that sediment and wood is going to go downstream. And part of me is like, okay, but more often than not, they don't move. Like we have had huge storms come through Charlotte and they do not move. And so they're pretty amazing.
Hmm.
Okay, I will say it's 3 o'clock, and just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm just going to make that announcement. I have another question, Ellen, if you have a moment, but
I do.
yeah, if folks are supposed to be at a meeting, there's your reminder that you should be there a minute ago. Yeah, so I was just curious, when we talk about kind of, the carbon or even just nutrient cycling storage, as well as maybe potential increases in biodiversity, depending on how you quantify those indicators. Do you think that there's, like you're saying, that the kind of level of uncertainty or the amount of detail you need to get to actually quantify those is there's too much uncertainty, or could something like that be incorporated into some sort of model to say, oh, here's a potential storage option? Did Wally just jump off the call? I was gonna say I saw Wally's face. I want to be like, all right, Brett, let's in.
I like the model name being used. It sounds like an insult. He's a
Yeah, I
brat.
know. It's like I didn't mean to call Wally a brat. That was yeah.
I guess what I would say is I would advocate for taking the samples before and after the restoration, and then, if possible, coming back a decade later and resampling. So, it's the usual answer. It depends. It depends on your budget,